Hi everyone, I'm John Fensel. We're here in Section 1 of Arlington National Cemetery. You know, there are 10 Revolutionary War veterans buried here at Arlington. They were actually reinterred here beginning in the late 19th, early 20th century from a cemetery just across the river in Georgetown. One of those veterans was James McCubbin Lingan. He fought alongside thousands of other colonists during the Revolution. He was a prisoner of war for more than 3 years. Many men died from that prisoner experience with the British, but Lingan actually survived the Revolution. And then later in 1812, he fought again for the right of free speech, and it was that fight that cost Lingan his life. And it's just really an incredible story, but it began decades earlier during the Revolutionary War. It was on July 13th, 1776, only 9 days after the United States of America declared its independence from Great Britain, that Lingan was commissioned a second lieutenant in the Rawlings Additional Regiment, and then he was 25 years old at that time. And then on November 16th, during the Battle of Fort Washington, he was stabbed with a bayonet and taken prisoner. For 3.5 years, he was held captive aboard the British ship Jersey. And during his imprisonment on board that ship, Lingan was approached by a British admiral, Sir Samuel Hood. He was a distant cousin, and he offered Lingan 10,000 pounds and a high commission in the British Army if he just renounced the Revolution and support King George. So sitting there in his cell, Lingan sat there, and that space was just too small to stand up or lie down in, but he looked up at the admiral and he replied, thanks, but I'll rot first. So on another occasion, while Lingan was still on board that prison ship, a fellow prisoner had died, and when the guards arrived to take the body, they brought along a coffin that was just too short to hold it. And so one of the guards suggested that they just cut off the dead prisoner's head and be done with it. But when he heard that, Lingan got up and he stood over that prisoner's body. He told the guards that he'd kill any of them who dared touch his fellow prisoner's body with a knife. And oh, by the way, he'd do it with his bare hands. The guards, well, they just found a larger coffin. By the end of the American Revolution, Lingan had risen to the rank of general, and following the war, he was appointed by President George Washington to be a collector at the port of Georgetown, just across the river, the Potomac River, on the other side. And there were many who thought that the Revolutionary War and defending the Constitution was just a one-and-done deal, especially in those early days of our country. But it really wasn't, especially not for James Lingan. And it was during the War of 1812 that Lingan found himself defending the First Amendment of our Constitution, a document that he'd fought so hard to create more than 30 years earlier. But this time he wasn't fighting against the British soldiers. Instead, it was his own fellow American citizens who opposed the freedom of the press. On June 19, 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain. It was a decision that didn't exactly have the unanimous backing of the American people, including a guy by the name of Alexander Hanson. Now, Hanson was a close friend of Lingan, and he was the editor of the Federal Republic newspaper in Baltimore that ran an editorial denouncing the call to arms against Britain. That editorial caused a lot of problems and riots because many of those readers viewed Hanson's editorial and his article as treasonous. So pretty soon a mob of angry citizens gathered in front of the newspaper's office. They broke in, they raided the office, and they destroyed all of his presses. And Hanson then was forced to run for his life. Now, Hanson was no shrinking violet either, because just a month later, on July 27th, Hanson continued his newspaper operation from a house in Georgetown. Within just a few hours, a mob gathered and shots were fired. Hanson fired some of those shots, as I understand it. Some folks came to his defense. Among his supporters were James Lingan and Light Horse Harry Lee, another famous general of the American Revolution and former governor of Virginia, and, oh, by the way, Robert E. Lee's father. Only the arrival of the militia prevented further violence, further bloodshed, but for their own protection, Hanson and his supporters were escorted to the jail in Baltimore, where they intended to stay until the mob dispersed. The only problem was the mob wasn't about to give up either. So they broke into the jail during the night, and a really fierce battle followed. Alexander Hansen actually survived that attack, but James Lingan was beaten to death, and this is how bad it was. Harry Lee was also beaten severely, but miraculously managed to stay alive by playing dead as the rioters rummaged through and among the victims. One of the scavengers even poured hot wax into Harry Lee's ear and eyes and looked for any sign of life. As a result, Lee did live to see another day, but he was blinded and permanently disabled. James Lingan's death upset an awful lot of people. St. John's Church, which is just across the river in Georgetown, was supposed to have been the site of the funeral, but the size of the crowd was so large that they forced the cemetery outside, and the stepson of George Washington Parke Custis, whose home is just up the road here at Arlington Cemetery, Arlington House, was asked to deliver Lee's eulogy, and he told everyone how highly President Washington regarded Lingan. Custis was very upset, and his voice trembled. This wasn't your normal eulogy. He praised Lingan for his defense of freedom, and he was so emotional that it said that even the veterans of the Revolutionary War cried for the first time since the war just listening to his words. But what George Washington Parke Custis did was chastise every citizen for allowing that massacre to take place, just in the first place. His quote was, "O Maryland, would that the waters of the Chesapeake could wash this foul stain from thy character." Lingan was buried in a burial ground in Georgetown, but here's what's so interesting, and it's these stories that and these coincidences that are buried here at Arlington. And this is what I wanted to show you, because we're right here at Lingan's grave. I'm going to turn the camera around. But nobody knew at that time that James Lingan's final resting place would be right here on Custis's former estate, and his body was reinterred right here at this very spot on November 5th, 1908. And if I could just read the stone here, you can see the design. It's beautiful. James McCubbin Lingan, an officer of the Maryland line in the War of the American Revolution, a captive on the prison ship Jersey, an original member of the Society of Cincinnati, born May 13th, 751, died July 28th, 1812, and then his wife Janet Henderson is buried there too. And on the very bottom, honor and peace to their souls. So there are many, many stories like this, many lessons that remain to be told here at Arlington, and this is just one of them. This is James Lingan. I thought you'd like to know.